Do you crave better self-esteem and confidence, but struggle to silence your anxiety, fears, and insecurities? If so, welcome to the Sisterhood of fellow travelers on the path to reclaiming their self-confidence and happiness. I'm Jennifer DeBellis, award-winning author, speaker, and assault survivor. I spent the past few decades helping young women like you overcome fear, self-doubt, and trauma to reclaim their joy and self-worth. I cannot wait to share the secrets I learned on my own healing journey and help you restore your inner warrior as I show you the skills and tools you need to save your own broken world. If you're ready to empower your inner warrior to overcome fear, doubt, and anxiety, turn off those distractions and tune in to this episode. So today I want to talk to you about Exodus, as in our departure from an old way of life and thinking. I don't know about you, but I've lost a ton of time wandering aimlessly in my own wilderness before I stepped into the promised land and learned how to live to my fullest potential. If you no longer want to remain a slave to your fears, doubts, unresolved trauma, and the anxiety these cause, this episode and mini-series is for you. In today's episode, we'll explore what it means to experience an Exodus. We'll learn a little backstory on the biblical Exodus and how it connects to our own journey to freedom. And we'll start to unpack some strategies to stop wandering around aimlessly in the wilderness of our darkest hours. So I want to talk a little bit about what Exodus means to me and some of the biblical backstory that inspired this thinking. Ultimately, we have become a generation that has normalized a heavy reliance on others and the powers above, when we've actually been created to help ourselves and to lean on God, higher powers, and others for support, provisions, and guidance. So we're supposed to trust the process and the promised outcomes while doing our part. And sometimes we forget about that last part, the while doing our part. We put our trust in the wrong things, and we want instant results, and we give up easily the moment things get hard or don't go as we hoped. And this is what leads me to that slave mentality that I want to talk to you about. So I want to talk to you a little bit first here about that slave mentality and some of the experience and training I have working with human trafficking survivors. So several years ago, I was working with a trafficking survivor organization, and we used to help people who were rescued out of human trafficking and slavery rehabilitate. And there was a lot of different nuanced steps that were involved in that process of teaching them how to take care of themselves, teaching them how to trust different forms of authority and trust systems and, learn how to do things that they've never had to do for themselves because someone was always making all the decisions for them. Someone was always telling them exactly what they had to do in that moment, what they had to do next. And then some of these individuals, some of these gals have been slaves since they were teenagers and kids. And so they've literally never gone into a store and even purchased something for themselves. And here we are trying to help them learn all these different skills, survival skills, and also, when to rely on the systems that are in place for them, how those systems are in place to keep them safe and to provide certain things for them and how they're supposed to work within those systems. And I learned something really interesting while I was doing the work, and it was rather surprising. It was a surprising twist that I didn't anticipate, and that was the resistance that was going to happen and the patterns of repetition that came into play to try to break down that resistance and that almost rebellion against trying to change, trying to learn, trying to adapt to freedom. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. Individuals trying to adapt to freedom and the fear of all of that power that they now have, and they don't know what to do with that. And sometimes that could be very overwhelming for a person also, to have too many options and too many choices and too many decisions when you come from a life where you didn't have to make all of those decisions and they were made for you. You didn't even have to decide what you wanted to eat for dinner because that decision was made for you. Even if you had to make it and prepare it, even if you had to go out and harvest it yourself, those decisions were still made for you. And now you have this completely different way of living. And so I really didn't expect that level of resistance. And individuals almost like failing in the system over and over and over again. Some people actually having to be removed from our programming, and they would lose spots in other programming that was provided through the government agencies that we worked really hard to get them into. And then they would sabotage these things, even when they were in safe spaces where they didn't have prior, slave owners, pimps, traffickers, whatever you want to name them. They didn't have those individuals trying to come in and bring them back into the system. Even when they were in safe spaces, they still continued to resist these new patterns and these new systems. And it didn't matter how much we tried to develop that trust and how much the systems kept showing them that they were okay, their provisions were going to be made, and they could do these things, and that would lead them to this. It was baffling. And had I not experienced that firsthand, the biblical story of Exodus might not have made the same sense to me, especially going back now as an older adult and revisiting that story and studying it more closely, which is something that I did about a year ago. And I've kind of been thinking about it and here and there ever since. But recently, it came up again. And I'm going to wait to get into that with you because I want to establish a couple of things right now before we get into that. Okay, so whether you're a spiritual person or not, I want to talk about the Exodus in the Bible. It's the story of slaves being freed only to wander in the wilderness right outside the promised land. And it was 4 decades. Imagine wandering around for 4 decades. That literally brings you to midlife. So imagine spending half of a lifetime, it's a long time, wandering around in the wilderness and getting stuck there because of your resistance, because of that rebellion and that distrust that comes out of that constant acting defiantly against the systems that are put into place to fulfill the promises and to lead you to that destined spot that you were created to be. The slave mentality is so ingrained in these Israelites. They wandered that desert for 40 years without being ready to enter the promised land. So think about that. They weren't ready. So they spent 40 years moving around in different spots, almost circling it. And there was a lot of fear involved. There's giants in the land. They're going to overtake us, all these different things. Didn't matter what God promised them. It didn't matter that, he led them out of slavery. He parts the Red Sea to let them have safe passage across a big body of water. And all the other provisions that he gave them along their 40 years in the wilderness, in this desert wilderness. There's a couple other things that kind of stood out to me a year ago when I did this study. And one of them was the caravan of individuals leaving Egypt and going into this wilderness. And I forget how long they traveled the first leg of the trip, but it was a time, and maybe like a couple of weeks. I'm going to come back in another episode and I will fact check that and be particular. But I remember it was enough time to where maybe it was even longer than 2 weeks, to where, you've got the elderly, the pregnant women, the women with young children, and the sick, all at the back of this caravan. And those are the weakest among them. And they're kind of tagging along. And in this story, God is leading from the front, and he's shrouded by this cloud by day, and he's shrouded by this kind of like cloud of fire by night. So his identity is hidden from them, but he's leading them from the front. And the only time he comes to the back is when the Egyptians start to come to take back their slaves, and he comes to the back now and he's protecting all of them, right? So he gets between them. He creates an obstacle between the two of them so that they don't perish or get sucked back in, captured back, and brought back to slavery. And so as we were doing this study and looking at this study, I started thinking about what happened to the people at the back. These are the weakest people. And, some of the literature was talking about how there were regular casualties. People were dying regularly. And think about dying, think about that. If you're sick or you're really, really old and you're trying to drag yourself across the wilderness, and it's just a cost of this freedom. So the cost of this freedom is that young children, pregnant women, sick, elderly, these people are perishing in this process. And so that's a really, it's kind of a powerful thing, but I want to hold on to that as kind of a metaphor about this concept of dying daily and the things that are sick in our own lives that are casualties that will die daily, and they have to die. They're a part of it. And and for whatever reason, why God allows those things to happen is a mystery. Why, even if you're not a faith person or you're struggling to say, how can there be a God that does those things? We still have to acknowledge even the science of life. The circle of life is scientific. We do not live forever. And even if we believe in the mythologies, we do not, in these physical bodies on this earth, live forever. And that's science. And so you have this concept of these nomads moving through. There are casualties, there's loss, and they're continuing. They have to push through. They have to continue on. Every time now, since I did this study, every time I think about this, I think about, wow, that saying, survival of the fittest, kind of starts rooting back to these types of experiences where only the strong survive and make it out of these places. And you can't leave people behind. So everybody goes, and you just hope that, you can stop and rest and do the things that you can do to try to get everybody out. But it's not a perfect system. And that's just, it's devastating to think about it, but I don't want us to get stuck there, because I just want to think about how even in that protection, even with being led, there's still the loss. And on top of the loss, there's these 40 years. So imagine what's happening in that 40 years of time, and that slave mentality is so ingrained in these people. That abuse, bondage, the reliance on all of their needs being met by their captors, all of these things were normalized. They were woven into the fibers of their being. And it was just ingrained so deeply that it couldn't just be easily rooted out of them. So much so that even though, think about it, I'm not saying 40 days. I'm not saying, okay, even after 40 days of being in the wilderness, they still didn't trust God. They still didn't trust the process. They still didn't trust, they're still free. They're setting up camp here. They're setting up camp there. They're still free. They have this freedom. They're making all these different decisions. There's a hierarchy of community that exists that I'm sure they have to rebuild. There's all those little nuanced things that are going on. And the sense of community starts to form, and that teamwork and all those things that have to exist in order for them to still sustain themselves, and do the things that they had to do in order to get through each day. And, think about this. They're not just setting up camp for 40 years and building big houses. They're moving around, and they're, for lots of different reasons, they're moving around, but they're moving around. They're not safe to just sit in one spot. Just because, one captor can't come and get them doesn't mean that there aren't other predators out there watching, from a mountaintop, thinking about what they can do, what they can come in and do. There's a lot of different moving parts here, but for 40 years, they lived in this nomad sense of freedom, and they still didn't develop
that trust, that they were going to be okay, that they weren't going to perish. And just imagine going through 40 years where you have this God in your life that is showing you and doing things for you, and you still just trust him. And that distrust cost them and kept them from living the life that they were destined to live if they only just believed in their mission and acted accordingly. Imagine they're grumbling, they're demanding, their speaker, Moses, on their behalf, keeps interceding for them. They need this, they need that, they need this. And it's like, oh, and here it is. And here's a way to get this. And here's a way to get this. And here's how to change this. And here's where I want you to go next. And over and over and over again, despite that grumbling, despite the constantly being met, almost like instant gratification, the very thing that we now struggle with also as a culture, this sense of instant gratification, and they still disbelieve, and they still don't put their trust in the process, or to know, like, I don't have to know everything, but I know it's going to be okay, or I know that my needs will be met, or I know that I have what it takes to do this or to do that, that confidence that comes out of our own doing. And maybe that was part of the problem too. I'm going to think about that when I'm going to be meditating on that, when I haven't had a chance to think about that. And so they're wandering aimlessly through each day. And you just have to wonder, like, were they mentally escaping to some imagined better place in their heads just to get through it? You know, like we do. I know I've done that, where it's like you're going through something where you're like, oh my God, this is so monotonous, or I can't do this anymore. Or, you know, I've got to just put my mind somewhere else to get through this. It's like, what were they, you know, how did they get through a day? You know, I don't know. They couldn't like check themselves into, you know, a clinic for their mental health, or they couldn't like, you know, take a week off to just be like, I'm going to go to the beach and get some fresh sea air. You know, I don't know. Maybe I'm overthinking that. So how does this apply to restoring your inner warrior? Well, someone recently asked me about this podcast series and what I hoped listeners would gain from tuning in regularly. Now, I have several interconnected reasons why I developed the Restore Your Inner Warrior podcast and why I hope you'll tune in to different episodes every week. But the one that was heavy on my heart when I was asked this question was Exodus. It was, I want to help people migrate from the places enslaving them to fear, doubt, trauma, anxiety. I want to help them enter their promised land. And you know that saying that you can take the girl out of the wilderness, but you can't take the wilderness out of the girl? I don't believe that. And it's because of this generation of Israelites that did enter the promised land that keeps me believing that we can lead and teach the wilderness out of the new creature that we become as we do the work and heal to restore that inner warrior. So, I mean, think about that. We actually can do that. And obviously, I'm a spiritual person, so I don't even try to do that without my connection to God. I don't even try. I don't try to live a single day without that spiritual connection. It's like I have to plug into that. But I also have enough confidence and trust and assurance to know that, like, God has equipped me to do a lot of really hard stuff, but also a lot of stuff that's very fulfilling. So I'm willing to do those things that I know I have to do. I trust certain processes. And when I don't trust those processes and that resistance costs me, because it always costs us. And so what do we do to take from that and to learn the lesson and figure out what it is that we need to learn from that, what needs to go, how we need to grow and evolve? and continue to become that new creature that we say we want to be, that healed and whole and happy person that thrives in the life that we build. And we have to do that work. And that's the part. No one can do the work for us. So when I think about these Israelites who were they moved from one point of slavery to another point of slavery where they were free, but yet they were still enslaved by the mentality that they just, even seeing it and living it and experiencing it, they still didn't retrain. And it took 4 generations, maybe 2. Let me back up. Those who did enter the promised land in the new generation were like in their 20s. And so those midlifers or individuals who were midlifers when they left Egypt and now they're in their 80s, now are like they're at the end of their life. But those who entered the promised land were like in their 20s. And so you think about it took 20 years to birth this new generation and rewire their DNA and then raise them up in the way to think and go in order to have the trust and the reliance and the work ethic. It's not just, here's the promise, go take it. It's also like a training up of what you need to do to inhabit these spaces, which isn't just a physical thing. It's also a mental thing. It's a spiritual thing. It's a type of readiness to fully inhabit it. So you think about how, in those 40 years, 20 years into that, the halfway from slavery, where you're still free, but you're still living like a slave as a nomad in the wilderness, unable to enter the promised land. You're birthing this new generation that is going to be prepared for 20 years to enter into that promised land. And they're the ones who finally don't have that resistant and rebellious mindset that God allows to go in. But it isn't just about allowing them. They believed that they would succeed at the mission, where everybody else was saying, it's too hard. There's too many big, they were saying giants. But if you think about how we can apply it to our own life, there's too many big challenges. There's too much trauma. There's too much hurt. There's too much. It's so hard. If you think about all the things that we believe and all the things that we say to ourselves to hold ourselves back when all we need to do is step in. We need to step in and lean on the right support, whether that's literal people or literal things in our life, or our spiritual leaning on provision and guidance and protection. And so we have the freedom to inhabit these spaces. We've been promised that we're destined to be in these spaces. We've also, if we've done the work of setting goals and letting those goals align with the desires of our heart, but also with the purpose that we're aware of, and all of those things come together and work for our good, then we're working toward that spot. And even though it might be intimidating, even though there might be fear attached to it, we still have to boldly step. Even in the fear, we have to take that step. And that's where that confidence comes in, that fierce confidence that you're like, okay, I can do this. And even if things go wrong, even if I get hurt on the way, I'm going to regroup. I'm going to figure it out and I'm going to go back stronger. So sometimes I think about Braveheart, and I think about at the end where they're rising up and the rebellion is alive and well. And like even prior to this, we're just going from battle to battle and the casualties are just overwhelming. And I just think about that scene where they just like swords are up and they're just charging into the danger. And I'm not saying that's the mindset that you should have, where you just charge in and, like to your own peril. I'm saying, have the right armor, have the right tools, do the right things prior to, going on that mission. I'm just saying there are times where we have to take those steps, and those steps have to be bold steps where we have the confidence despite the fear, despite the doubt and the anxiety that are birthed from these feelings and emotions. And we have to learn from it. And most of the time, we will see that we survive and that we actually thrive in the process and that we get there or we get one step closer to where it is we're on our way to go. And that should also be encouraging to us. And that should be the thing that builds our trust, because now we're trusting in the process, because we're seeing. There's a difference between trust and faith. And a lot of times people confuse the two. And I was talking to my husband about this a couple weeks ago, and he was like, well, trust is given. And I said, no, trust is earned. And sometimes trust is broken, and then trust has to be re-earned. It has to be healed, demonstrate that you're trustworthy again. And that could take time. And that's not to say that, people are always entirely forgiving or they let things go. It doesn't matter, how many good things you do or how much you show them. There will be those people who won't trust you again, and it has nothing to do with you. That's a them problem, because we all mess up. We all need to be forgiven for something. We all do something that somehow shakes trust and people's faith in us. But if we can talk about faith, faith is literally like this form of trust and belief despite the evidence. And I'm not talking about that here. I'm talking about the type of trust that we have seen the evidence. We've seen the fruit. We've seen what it's produced, and we still distrust it. Like, there's got to be something really broken in you if you can't begin to trust something after repeatedly seeing that the benefits of it, to see that it's not the thing that you fear. The thing that you actually want to be happening is happening, and yet we still keep distrusting it. Or it's helping us get toward that thing that we want, and we keep distrusting it. And again, I'm not saying you're stupid. I'm saying there's got to be something broken in you that has nothing to do with that trust in that particular thing necessarily, but that has to be dealt with. So sometimes maybe we need to figure out what it is that's keeping us from trusting things that we should be trusting. Because we definitely should be establishing patterns of trust when there are patterns of success that are showing us that's a trustworthy thing, or that's a trustworthy person, or that thing continually keeps leading me, keeps producing what I want it to produce, and keeps leading me where I want it to be leading me. So there's no reason to resist that. There's no reason to be leery about that. We can proceed with caution for everything we do, but there's a difference between, again, avoidance and proceeding with caution. Totally distrusting and rebelling against the very things that are in place for us and are working for us, because we have this, whatever, we have a hang up of some sort. Maybe it's a hang up. Something's broken. So again, I'm not really sure, if you've got that issue with trust, if it's a hang up, if it's this broken area. But now that I mention that, I'm sure that's kind of lighting a fire that maybe will be a torch that kind of lights the way for you down this dark path of memory to figure out what is that broken thing that is really weaved and intertwined into your fibers that keep you in this bondage to the very thing that enslaved you to begin with, or that hurt you to begin with. And that's often how trauma works, and how it keeps being triggered is we don't understand that hardwire that goes in deeply rooted into us. And those triggers are those external things where how many times do we say, why did that just set me off that way? That person maybe is a stranger. There's no way that things are that deep where I could get that much of a rise from that particular person who's a stranger, or that person I adore. Why did that just trigger me? And a lot of times we just don't understand. It's just like this dynamite that takes a while to hit the actual trigger point that's buried so deep inside us, we don't know what it is. And so I'm challenging you to kind of like take the torch in and figure out if there's an area in you that is an old area of slavery to a fear or a doubt or the anxieties that go along and are attached to these old traumas that keeps you distrusting the new stuff that is already demonstrated that it's trustworthy. So maybe you think about that over the next week. And I also wanted you to consider this. Do you want to remain a slave to these fears, doubts, unresolved trauma, and the anxiety that these cause? Or are you ready to put in the work to stop wandering around aimlessly in the wilderness of your darkest hours? So if this is really speaking to you today, I want you to be thinking about all these things that I'm leaving you with in closing right now, and then come back to the next episode where I'm going to go deeper into this Exodus topic, obviously, but I'm going to go deeper into some of these things that I said. Let me think about that. Let me think about this. I'm going to be meditating on this hardwire that keeps us trusting the very things that enslaved us to begin with, instead of trusting the things that continually show us the way to our freedom or have already brought us into that place of freedom, and we just don't know how to inhabit it because we still feel tethered to the thing that's enslaving us. So when we come back next week, I'm going to jump right into that, and I hope that you will have had time to think about these things and we can have a meaningful connection then. So in the meantime, just keep putting in that hard work to restore that inner warrior and re-strengthen and rebuild that fierce confidence that helps you charge into each day.
Well, girl, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If so, don't forget to follow my channel and share it with girlfriends who also want to restore their self-worth and confidence. Also, if this podcast inspired you, consider leaving a 5-star written review on Apple Podcasts. And as you go through your day, may your empowered spirit, heart, and mind guide you. Catch new episodes every Friday. Ciao.